In the sweltering heat of Louisiana's plantation country, enslaved cabins were meant to hold only what the law allowed: black bodies, unpaid labor, and silence. But every so often something appeared inside those wooden walls that shattered the lie the entire system was built on. Babies with pale skin, light eyes, hair too soft, too straight to be explained away. Neighbors whispered, overseers looked the other way, and plantation owners, men who publicly defended slavery with Bible verses and law books, knew exactly why these children existed. They were living evidence of what could never be written down. Proof that the line between master and enslaved had been crossed, again and again, not by love, but by power. These infants couldn't be sold easily, couldn't be displayed openly, and couldn't be acknowledged without exposing crimes that the system depended on ignoring. So the babies stayed hidden in slave cabins, raised in shadows, their very faces threatening to collapse the moral fiction of Southern honor. Louisiana didn't just find white passing children among the enslaved freight, it found the truth. Slavery worked hardest to bury. In the cramped wooden cabins that lined Louisiana's plantations, space was scarce, privacy non-existent. Space was scarce, privacy non-existent, and survival depended on silence. These structures were designed to house enslaved laborers at the margins of plantation life, far from the main house where wealth and authority lived. Yet within these cabins, planters and overseers sometimes encountered something that unsettled even those hardened by brutality: infants whose skin was pale, whose hair fell straight or lightly curled, whose eyes reflected colors that the racial order insisted should not exist among the enslaved. These discoveries were not accidents or mysteries to the people who ran the plantations, but they were treated as if they were, because acknowledging the truth behind them threatened the entire logic of slavery. White passing babies were not rare anomalies. They were the predictable result of a system that granted white men unchecked power over enslaved women's bodies. Enslaved cabins became the birthplace of these children because that was where enslaved women lived, labored, gave birth, and were forced to recover quickly enough to return to work. The cabins were not spaces of safety. They were spaces of control. When a baby with visibly European features appeared there, it forced everyone involved to confront what was usually hidden behind closed doors and unspoken rules. Plantation records often avoided describing these infants in detail. Births were logged with vague language or not at all. Skin tone, when mentioned, was softened into euphemisms like light, yellow, or nearly white. But physical appearance could not be erased so easily. Other enslaved people saw these children immediately and understood what they represented. They knew which white man visited which woman immediately and understood what they represented. They knew which white man visited which woman, which nights the cabin doors were opened without consent, which pregnancies were followed by threats instead of celebration. For the enslaved community, the appearance of a white passing baby was not shocking. It was painful confirmation of what they already knew. For plantation owners, however, these children created a different problem. Slavery depended on rigid racial boundaries. Whiteness meant freedom, inheritance, legitimacy. Blackness meant enslavement, dispossession, and perpetual labor. A child who looked white but was legally enslaved exposed the fragility of those boundaries. The law tried to resolve this by declaring that a child inherited the status of the mother, no matter the father. But law could not control faces. When an infant in a slave cabin looked like the master's legitimate children in the big house, the contradiction became visible. These babies were often kept out of sight. Some were hidden during visits from outsiders. Others were assigned quickly to field labor as they grew, where sun exposure and physical exhaustion might darken their appearance over time. In certain cases, children were sold away early, sent to distant plantations where no one knew their origins. The goal was not just profit, but erasure. The plantation needed these children to disappear before they raised questions that could not be safely answered. The cabins themselves became places of quiet negotiation and fear. Enslaved mothers knew that their children's appearance could bring punishment rather than protection. A baby who resembled a white man could provoke jealousy from the owner's wife, anger from overseers, or resentment from other whites who felt the racial order was being mocked. Some women tried to shield their children as much as possible, keeping them indoors, limiting contact, teaching them silence early. Others had no choice but to surrender them, watching as their children were taken away under the pretense of sale or reassignment. White-passing infants also unsettled white women on plantations, even when nothing was said aloud. The presence of these children was a reminder of the sexual violence that underpinned plantation life, violence that respectable society pretended did not exist. A baby in a slave cabin with pale skin could resemble the master, a brother, a son. That resemblance was dangerous because it could not be dismissed as rumor. It walked, cried, and breathed in plain sight. Among enslaved people, these children occupied a complicated position. They were not seen as privileged, even when given lighter work or temporary protection. Instead, they were often pitied. Their appearance made them targets from all sides. They carried the physical mark of violence without any of the protection that whiteness was supposed to guarantee. Their lives demonstrated that racial categories were tools of power, not reflections of reality. As these children grew older, their existence continued to challenge plantation order. Adolescents who could pass for white if they escaped faced brutal punishment if caught, because their appearance made their resistance especially threatening. A light-skinned enslaved person running from bondage disrupted not only labor control, but the visual logic of slavery itself. Patrols were trained to question anyone who looked white without papers, but the possibility that an enslaved person could blend into white society terrified slaveholders. The cabins where these babies were born became silent archives of plantation secrets. Each pale-skinned infant was the result of a story that could never be told openly. The wood walls absorbed cries, threats, and whispered instructions. Nothing in the architecture acknowledged the violence that produced these children, yet their presence rewrote the meaning of the space. A slave cabin was no longer just a site of labor reproduction. It was proof that the plantation's moral claims were false. Even after emancipation, many of these stories remained buried. Families carried memories of ancestors who looked white but were born enslaved. Oral histories spoke of babies hidden, sold, or renamed. Official histories often ignored them because their existence complicated narratives of clear racial divisions. Louisiana's plantations did not accidentally find white-passing babies in slave cabins. They produced them through a system that allowed power without accountability. Each discovery of such a child forced a moment of recognition, even if it was quickly suppressed. The cabin, the infant, the silence that followed all of it revealed how deeply slavery relied on denial. These babies were not exceptions to the system. They were evidence of how the system truly worked, written not in laws or ledgers, but in skin, hair, and the places where enslaved women were forced to give birth. Plantation owners in Louisiana rarely spoke openly about the children they fathered with enslaved women, but within the private world of the plantation, paternity was often quietly understood. Everyone knew. Overseers knew which man visited which cabin. Enslaved women knew who stood in the doorway at night. Even other enslaved people could trace the resemblance between certain children and the men who claimed ownership over their mothers. This knowledge existed in a strange, unspoken space acknowledged enough to shape decisions, but denied enough to protect reputations. Private acknowledgement did not mean responsibility. When an owner recognized that a white-passing child was his, the recognition usually led not to protection, but to calculation. The child represented risk. Publicly admitting paternity would mean admitting to sexual relations with an enslaved woman, something widely practiced yet officially condemned as immoral. It could invite legal challenges, family scandal, or questions about inheritance, so the acknowledgement stayed behind closed doors, expressed through indirect actions rather than words. Sometimes this took the form of subtle privileges. A child might be assigned lighter labor, trained as a house servant instead of a field hand, or given access to basic education that others were denied. These gestures were not acts of kindness, they were attempts to manage guilt and control. By shaping the child's life quietly, the owner could convince himself that he had done something without ever threatening the system that allowed him to exploit the child's mother in the first place. In many cases, private acknowledgement meant distance. Owners arranged for these children to be sold to other plantations, often far away. The sale was framed as routine business, but the choice of location was deliberate. Distance reduced the chance of recognition. A child who looked too much like the master could not remain close without raising questions. Selling the child allowed the owner to erase daily reminders of his actions while still profiting from the system that made those actions possible. The mothers of these children were rarely consulted. Their bodies had been used without consent, and their children were treated as problems to be solved. An owner might acknowledge paternity while simultaneously denying the mother any voice in her child's fate. In some cases, women were threatened into silence, warned that speaking about the child's father would result in punishment or separation. Private acknowledgement functioned as another form of power, reinforcing who had the right to know and who was forced to forget. Plantation wives were often aware as well, even when nothing was spoken aloud. A child with familiar eyes or a distinctive expression could not be easily ignored. Some wives responded with anger toward the enslaved woman, punishing her for what their husbands had done. Others insisted the child be removed from the plantation entirely. In these moments, private acknowledgement became a household matter, negotiated through cruelty, denial, and forced distance rather than accountability. The legal system supported this arrangement. Laws that tied a child's status to the mother allowed white fathers to acknowledge paternity privately without consequences. A man could know a child was his and still own that child as property. This legal framework turned private acknowledgement into something hollow. It carried no obligation to free, protect, or publicly recognize the child. Instead, it allowed owners to compartmentalize their actions, separating personal knowledge from public identity. Among enslaved communities, this private acknowledgement was understood but rarely spoken. It shaped relationships and expectations. A child rumored to be the master's might be treated with caution by overseers or resented by others who saw any small privilege as dangerous favoritism. At the same time, such children were often isolated, never fully belonging, always marked by the circumstances of their birth. The knowledge of who their father was offered no real security, only additional scrutiny. As these children grew, private acknowledgement sometimes took the form of limited protection from extreme punishment. An owner might intervene quietly to prevent a beating or a sale under particularly harsh conditions. But this protection was conditional and could be withdrawn at any moment. It depended entirely on the owner's mood, reputation, and calculation of risk. The child's safety rested not on rights, but on the same arbitrary power that had created their existence. Some owners went so far as to arrange informal apprenticeships or allow these children to learn skilled trades. This, too, was done discreetly. A skilled enslaved worker could be valuable, and training a child who resembled the owner could be framed as an economic decision rather than a moral one. The line between self-interest and suppressed guilt was thin, and the system encouraged owners to blur it whenever possible. Private acknowledgement also extended into the realm of silence after death. Wills rarely mentioned these children. Estates passed to legitimate white heirs, while enslaved children of the same bloodline were listed alongside livestock and furniture. Any personal recognition died with the owner, leaving the child vulnerable to sale, separation, or harsher treatment under new management. The acknowledgement had never been meant to last. This quiet, internal recognition allowed plantation owners to live with contradictions. They could see their own features reflected in enslaved children and still uphold a system that denied those children humanity. By keeping acknowledgement private, they avoided confronting the moral consequences of their actions. The plantation functioned as a space where truth was known but never named, where paternity existed without responsibility, and where silence was as important as violence in maintaining control. On Louisiana plantations, the phrase house privilege was often used to describe assignments that kept certain enslaved women indoors, closer to the main house, away from the fields. To outsiders and later apologists, this language suggested comfort, safety, or favoritism. In reality, it frequently masked a system of sexual access that benefited white men and trapped enslaved women in a more intimate form of captivity. What was framed as privilege was, in many cases, a rebranding of coercion, a way to normalize abuse without naming it. Women selected for house labor were chosen not only for skill or obedience, but for youth, appearance, and vulnerability. Once inside the main house, they were under constant surveillance and constant availability. Their proximity to the master and his male relatives erased any remaining boundary between labor and violation. Refusal was not possible. Consent had no meaning in a system where one person owned another. Yet plantation culture insisted on pretending otherwise, using softer language to disguise brutality. Sexual violence under slavery rarely looked like public force. It was routine, quiet, and bureaucratic. A man entering a servant's room at night did not need to threaten her with a whip because the threat already existed in every aspect of her life. Her body, her children, her food, her survival were all controlled by the same authority. Calling this arrangement house privilege allowed owners to deny the violence inherent in it while still benefiting from it. The children born from these assaults exposed the lie. When white passing babies appeared, the narrative of privilege began to crack. A child's skin color revealed what polite language tried to conceal. These infants were evidence that what had been described as domestic service or special favor was in fact repeated sexual exploitation. Plantation owners responded not by questioning the system, but by reinforcing the euphemisms, doubling down on silence. Enslaved women understood the danger of being labeled privileged. House assignments came with isolation from community, increased scrutiny from white women, and heightened vulnerability to sexual assault. Field labor was brutal and deadly, but it offered the protection of numbers and distance. Inside the house, a woman was alone, visible, and unprotected. Privilege meant being closer to power, and proximity to power under slavery meant exposure to abuse. White mistresses often played a role in maintaining the fiction. Some blamed enslaved women for their husbands' actions, accusing them of seduction or moral weakness. This narrative preserved the image of white male respectability while redirecting anger downward. Punishments were inflicted not on the perpetrators but on the victims. In this way, sexual violence was enforced by both male authority and female complicity, all under the cover of household order. Records from the period reveal how deeply this language shaped perception. Enslaved women described in inventories as favorite, trusted, or well-treated were often those most at risk. These descriptors reassured buyers and neighbors that nothing improper was happening, even as pregnancies, mixed-race children, and whispered knowledge told a different story. The plantation depended on everyone understanding the truth while agreeing never to state it openly. House privilege also functioned as a threat. Women knew that being moved into the house could mean sexual access for the owner or his sons. Refusing such a move was seen as defiance. Accepting it meant exposure. Either choice carried consequences. The system was designed so that there was no safe position, only varying degrees of harm disguised as opportunity. For enslaved men, this dynamic added another layer of humiliation and powerlessness. They watched partners and daughters assigned to the house, fully aware of what that meant, unable to intervene. The language of privilege stripped them of the ability to name what was happening, turning violence into something officially non-existent. This silence fractured families and communities, not because the truth was unknown, but because it was unspeakable. White passing children born from these conditions complicated the hierarchy further. They were often labeled as products of relationships or connections, words chosen carefully to avoid acknowledging rape. These terms implied neutrality where none existed. The reality was that enslaved women had no legal right to refuse sex, no recourse if assaulted, and no authority over the children that resulted. Privilege, in this context, meant being closer to the source of violation. The plantation system relied heavily on appearances. A household that appeared orderly, calm, and benevolent was less likely to attract scrutiny. Euphemisms like house privilege were tools of reputation management. They allowed owners to present themselves as paternal figures rather than abusers. As long as violence remained unnamed, it could continue uninterrupted. Even abolitionist accounts struggled with this language at times, describing enslaved women as kept or attached to masters, unintentionally reinforcing the idea of choice. This reflects how deeply the masking had worked. When violence is normalized through repetition in softened language, even critics can absorb its framing. The result was a historical record that often underplayed the extent of sexual abuse while documenting its consequences. The existence of white passing babies in slave cabins was one of those consequences that could not be fully disguised. No amount of euphemism could change a child's face. These infants disrupted the story that house assignments were benign or beneficial. They revealed that so-called privilege was inseparable from exploitation, that access to the house often meant access to a woman's body without consent. By calling sexual violence privilege, the plantation inverted reality. It transformed harm into favor and abuse into opportunity. This inversion protected perpetrators and isolated victims, forcing them to navigate a world where naming their own suffering could bring punishment rather than relief. The language itself became a weapon, shaping how violence was understood, remembered, and denied, ensuring that what happened inside the big house remained officially invisible while continuing generation after generation. The legal principle that governed the lives of enslaved children in Louisiana and across the American South was deceptively simple. A child inherited the status of the mother, known in legal doctrine as partus sequitur ventrum. This rule ensured that no matter who the father was, the child of an enslaved woman would also be enslaved. On paper, it resolved questions of property and ownership. In reality, it legalized exploitation and turned sexual violence into an economic strategy. This law did not emerge by accident. Earlier European legal traditions often tied a child's status to the father, but colonial slave societies reversed this logic deliberately. If the status followed the father, then white men who raped enslaved women would produce free children, undermining slavery's labor base and creating legal obligations they did not want. By tying status to the mother, lawmakers protected white men from responsibility while guaranteeing that any child born from coercion increased the enslaved population. For plantation owners, this law was foundational. It meant that rape carried no legal risk, only potential profit. A child who resembled the master was still his property if the mother was enslaved. The law transformed the wombs of enslaved women into sites of production where violence could be converted directly into labor and wealth. White passing babies born in slave cabins were not legal anomalies. They were expected outcomes of a system designed to absorb contradiction without consequence. The cruelty of this principle became especially visible when children looked white. Their appearance challenged social assumptions, but the law remained unmoved. Courts did not care about skin color, hair texture, or facial features. Documentation mattered more than a reality. As long as a woman was legally enslaved, her child belonged to her owner, even if that owner was also the child's biological father. This legal clarity allowed moral confusion to persist without resolution. Enslaved women understood this law intimately, even if they never encountered it in written form. They knew that pregnancy did not bring protection, only deeper vulnerability. Giving birth meant producing another enslaved person, another body subject to sale, punishment, and control. When a child was visibly white passing, the law offered no shield. If anything, it made the child more dangerous to keep close, increasing the likelihood of separation. Plantation records reveal how this doctrine shaped everyday decisions. Children were listed under their mother's name, their value assessed alongside her labor capacity. Fathers were irrelevant in official terms. Even when paternity was privately acknowledged, it had no standing in law. A man could recognize his own child and still sign documents that treated that child as livestock. The law allowed emotional recognition without legal consequence, reinforcing the divide between knowledge and accountability. This principle also discouraged public challenges to slavery's moral claims. If white men were forced to confront the legal implications of fathering enslaved children, the system would fracture under its own hypocrisy. Instead, partus sequitur ventrum sealed those fractures. It absorbed sexual violence into routine administration. Births were recorded, values calculated, labor projected. The violence that produced these children disappeared behind paperwork. For white society, the law provided reassurance. It allowed people to encounter enslaved children who looked white without questioning the racial order. The explanation was always the same. The mother was enslaved, therefore the child was enslaved. This circular logic prevented deeper inquiry. Whiteness became a social category rather than a biological one, assigned by law rather than appearance, controlled by power rather than truth. The doctrine also shaped the emotional lives of enslaved families. Mothers were forced to raise children who carried the visible features of their abusers, knowing that the law offered no recognition of that abuse. These children embodied the system's cruelty in physical form. They were reminders that even the most intimate violations were sanctioned and that the law stood firmly with the violator. In cases where white-passing children attempted escape, the law followed them. A child who could blend into white society still carried the legal status of enslavement. Capture meant severe punishment, not only for fleeing but for threatening the visual order slavery depended on. A person who looked white yet was legally enslaved exposed the artificiality of racial categories, making their freedom especially intolerable to slaveholders. Occasionally, challenges arose in courts when individuals claimed freedom based on appearance or alleged white ancestry. These cases were rare and often unsuccessful. Judges relied on maternal status, documentation, and community testimony rather than physical traits. The law consistently prioritized property rights over human evidence. Even when doubt existed, it was resolved in favor of enslavement, reinforcing the system's bias toward control. The maternal status rule also influenced how plantation owners managed enslaved women's reproduction. Women deemed likely to bear lighter-skinned children were sometimes treated as valuable breeders, not because of any concern for the child, but because proximity to the master increased the likelihood of pregnancies that expanded the labor force. The law turned intimacy into investment, erasing any boundary between personal violation and economic planning. Over time, this doctrine normalized the presence of white-passing enslaved people. Their existence no longer shocked the system because the law had already accounted for them. What might have been evidence of moral collapse became routine. The cabins where these children were born, the records that listed them, and the laws that bound them together formed a closed loop of justification. After emancipation, the legacy of this rule lingered. Families struggled to trace lineage in records that erased fathers by design. Descendants inherited stories of ancestors who looked white but were enslaved, their status determined not by who they were, but by who their mothers had been legally allowed to be. The law had done its work thoroughly, shaping lives long after it ceased to exist. By defining a child's fate through the enslaved mother, the legal system ensured that sexual violence remained profitable, invisible, and unquestioned. It created a world where a baby's appearance could contradict the social order, while the law calmly reaffirmed it, where truth lived in faces and silence lived in statutes, where injustice did not need to be hidden because it was fully authorized. When white-passing babies were born in slave cabins, their existence created immediate anxiety for plantation owners. These children were not only reminders of sexual violence but also potential legal and social threats. A child who looked white could provoke questions from neighbors, visitors, or distant relatives. Silence alone was not always enough. To protect reputations and property claims, many owners chose concealment as their first response, followed by removal when concealment failed. Hiding these infants often began at birth. Midwives were warned to speak carefully. Records were altered or left incomplete. Babies were kept inside cabins during daylight hours, or moved between locations to avoid notice. Enslaved mothers were instructed to keep their children away from roads and gathering places. The goal was to reduce visibility, to prevent the child's appearance from becoming a subject of conversation. On plantations where social visits were common, this concealment became a daily discipline enforced through threats and surveillance. Concealment was not meant to last forever. Children grow, features sharpen, and resemblance becomes harder to deny. As white-passing infants reached early childhood, the risk increased. A toddler with pale skin and light eyes could not be explained away indefinitely. At this point, many owners turned to separation as a more permanent solution. Sale became the most efficient method of erasure. Children were often sold at a young age, sometimes without warning to the mother. The transaction was framed as ordinary commerce, but the timing revealed its purpose. Sales occurred after a child's appearance became noticeable, or after rumors began to circulate. Buyers were selected carefully, often from distant regions where no one knew the family history. Distance protected the seller from future recognition and gossip. For enslaved mothers, this process was devastating. They understood why their children were taken, even when no explanation was given. The child's appearance had marked them as dangerous to the plantation's image. Mothers were powerless to stop the separation. Protests could result in punishment or further loss. Silence became a survival strategy, even as it compounded the trauma. In some cases, owners chose a different form of hiding: reassignment. A child might be sent to another plantation owned by a relative or business partner. This allowed the owner to maintain control while removing the child from immediate view. The arrangement preserved property rights and minimized scandal. The child disappeared from the local landscape without ever leaving the owner's network. These decisions were rarely motivated by concern for the child's well-being. They were calculations based on risk management. A white-passing enslaved child challenged the visual logic of slavery. Such a child made it harder to argue that race was natural, fixed, and visible. By removing the child, owners removed a contradiction they did not want to explain. Plantation wives often influenced these choices. For them, the presence of such children could feel like a public humiliation. Even when guests never spoke of it, the resemblance could be obvious. Removal restored domestic order and preserved appearances. In many households, the decision to sell or hide a child was a response to pressure from within the white family as much as from the outside world. Hiding also extended to language. When children were sold, their descriptions in bills of sale were deliberately vague. Skin tone was minimized. Parentage was never mentioned. The transaction erased the story behind the child, reducing them to age, sex, and labor potential. This paperwork allowed buyers to accept the child without asking questions, reinforcing a culture of willful ignorance. Some children were kept hidden longer because of perceived value. Light-skinned children were sometimes seen as more marketable, capable of passing as servants or skilled laborers in urban settings. Their appearance could fetch higher prices if managed carefully. Even in these cases, hiding was temporary. Visibility remained a liability that had to be controlled. Within enslaved communities, the disappearance of such children was understood. People noticed when a pale-skinned child suddenly vanished. They understood the pattern even if they did not speak of it openly. These disappearances became part of collective memory, reinforcing the lesson that resemblance to whiteness did not offer protection, only new forms of danger. Children who were sold away carried the consequences for life. Removed from family and familiar surroundings, they entered new plantations where their appearance might again provoke suspicion or hostility. Some faced harsher treatment precisely because they looked different. Others were subjected to increased scrutiny, as overseers watched them closely for signs of resistance or attempted escape. For owners, the act of selling these children resolved an immediate problem, but reinforced a larger system of denial. By removing evidence, they avoided confronting the reality of their actions. The plantation returned to its outward appearance of order. The cabin where the child had been born returned to being just another laborer's dwelling, its history unrecorded. Hiding and selling also served as warnings to others. Enslaved women learned that bearing a child who resembled a white man could result in immediate loss. This knowledge added another layer of fear to pregnancy. It reinforced control over women's bodies by making the consequences of visibility severe and irreversible. Occasionally, owners attempted to hide children within the plantation hierarchy by assigning them roles that kept them out of sight. A child might be sent to work in kitchens, stables, or remote fields. These strategies delayed the inevitable, but they reflected the same impulse: manage the contradiction rather than address it. The removal of white-passing babies was not an exception, but a recurring practice shaped by social norms and economic incentives. Each hidden child represented an effort to maintain the fiction that slavery operated within clear moral and racial boundaries. Each sale was an act of erasure designed to protect those boundaries from scrutiny. What remained were gaps in families, unexplained absences, and stories passed quietly from one generation to the next. The system relied on these disappearances. It depended on the ability to make people vanish before their existence demanded explanation. In hiding and selling white-passing babies, plantation owners protected not only their reputations, but the fragile logic that allowed slavery to continue without openly acknowledging its most intimate crimes. On plantations across Louisiana, overseers functioned as the enforcers of silence. They were the ones who moved between the owner's authority and the enslaved population, translating unspoken expectations into daily control. When white-passing babies appeared in slave cabins, overseers were often the first to recognize the danger such children posed to the plantation's order. Their role was not to question how the child came to exist, but to ensure that no one talked about it in ways that could reach beyond the plantation gates. Silence was rarely requested politely. Overseers issued warnings disguised as instructions. Enslaved women were told to mind their tongues, to keep children indoors, to answer questions with rehearsed phrases. Any deviation could be interpreted as defiance. The threat of punishment hovered constantly, making silence a survival skill rather than a choice. People learned quickly which topics were forbidden, not because they were secret, but because they were too true. Record manipulation was another critical tool. Overseers kept logs of births, deaths, labor output, and punishments. These records shaped how enslaved people were valued and tracked. When a white passing child was born, descriptions became deliberately vague. Skin color was softened or omitted. Parentage was never acknowledged. Ages were adjusted. Sometimes births were recorded late or not at all. Paperwork became a shield, protecting the plantation from scrutiny by erasing inconvenient details. This manipulation was systematic, not accidental. Overseers understood that records could travel beyond the plantation, inspected by buyers, creditors, or officials. A ledger that raised questions could threaten business relationships. By controlling what was written down, overseers controlled what could be officially known. The truth existed only in memory and bodies, never in ink. Enslaved people were acutely aware of this dynamic. They saw how records could erase a life or redefine it. A child could be born, live for years, and then disappear from documents as if they had never existed. When white passing children were sold or transferred, paperwork often made the transition seamless, presenting it as routine movement to property rather than deliberate concealment. This bureaucratic smoothness masked the violence of separation. Overseers also policed conversation. Gatherings were monitored. Whispers were punished. Songs, jokes, or stories that hinted too closely at the truth could bring consequences. The goal was not absolute ignorance but controlled knowledge. People could know privately what was happening as long as they never named it publicly. Silence maintained order more effectively than denial. In some cases, overseers used informants within the enslaved community. Rewards, small privileges, or reduced punishment were offered in exchange for information. This fostered mistrust and fragmentation. When a white passing child became a subject of quiet attention, overseers wanted to know who was talking, who was asking questions, who might spread the story beyond the plantation. Surveillance extended into the most intimate spaces of enslaved life. Owners often relied heavily on overseers in these situations. Publicly, the owner could maintain distance, appearing uninvolved or unaware. Privately, instructions were given clearly. Manage the situation, keep it quiet, fix the records. Overseers acted as buffers, absorbing the moral dirt of the system while preserving the owner's image. This division of labor allowed slaveholders to deny responsibility even to themselves. The manipulation of records had long-term consequences. After emancipation, formerly enslaved people searching for family histories encountered gaps and contradictions. Children vanished from ledgers. Names changed without explanation. Ages did not align. These inconsistencies were not errors but intentional distortions designed to protect power. White passing children were among the most likely to be erased, their paper trails deliberately weakened. Silence was enforced not only through fear, but through routine. Over time, people learned what not to say without being told. The presence of overseers, their glances, their pauses, their sudden appearances near cabins where certain children lived, communicated boundaries. Silence became embedded in daily life, shaping how people spoke, remembered, and passed stories to the next generation. Even overseers themselves were constrained by the system. Many were aware of the violence and hypocrisy they were managing, but their position depended on loyalty. Questioning the owner's behavior or acknowledging the truth openly could cost them their job or worse. They participated in silence because silence was profitable. The plantation rewarded those who kept its secrets intact. When outside visitors arrived, overseers intensified their efforts. Children were moved. Cabins were rearranged. Enslaved people were instructed on what to say if questioned. A white passing child might be temporarily relocated or kept hidden until guests left. These performances reinforced the plantation's public image as orderly and moral, even as they required constant suppression of reality. The system depended on repetition. Each time silence was enforced successfully, it became easier to enforce again. Each manipulated record set a precedent. Over time, the existence of white passing children no longer triggered alarm but procedure. Overseers knew exactly what to do. Silence was not improvised, it was rehearsed. This culture of silence did not mean ignorance. It meant shared understanding without shared language. Everyone involved knew why the baby looked the way it did. Everyone knew why records were altered. Everyone knew why certain children disappeared. The overseer's job was to ensure that this knowledge never solidified into testimony. By ordering silence and reshaping records, overseers turned violence into something administratively manageable. The plantation could continue functioning without confronting its contradictions. The cabins remained quiet, the ledgers remained clean, and the truth remained trapped between what was seen and what was allowed to be said. For enslaved women, raising children who visibly resembled their abusers was a daily confrontation with trauma that had no space for acknowledgement or healing. These children carried the physical markers of violence in their faces, skin, and hair, making the past impossible to forget. Every time a mother looked at her child, she was reminded not only of the assault itself, but of the power imbalance that made resistance impossible and justice unattainable. Motherhood under slavery was already shaped by fear. Children could be sold at any moment, families broken without warning. For women with white-passing children, that fear was intensified. Their children's appearance made them more noticeable, more vulnerable to removal, more likely to attract the attention of overseers and owners. What might look like closeness to whiteness from the outside functioned as a liability that hovered over every stage of the child's life. These mothers were forced to perform emotional labor on top of physical labor. They had to protect their children while teaching them caution from an early age. Silence became a lesson taught almost as soon as speech. Children were warned not to ask questions, not to wander, not to draw attention. A mother's love had to be expressed through restraint, through constant vigilance, through the painful act of preparing a child for a world that would punish them for how they looked. The resemblance to a white man was never neutral. It shaped how others treated the child and the mother. Some overseers watched these children more closely, assuming they were more likely to resist or escape. Some white women treated the mothers with increased hostility, projecting their anger and humiliation onto the person with the least power. Even within enslaved communities, the child's appearance could create distance, not because of blame, but because difference carried risk. For mothers, this meant isolation. Their suffering was specific and could not always be shared openly. Speaking about the child's father was dangerous. Naming the truth could bring retaliation. So pain was internalized, carried quietly while life continued under constant surveillance. The child became both a source of love and a living reminder of violation, a contradiction that no one helped resolve. These women also faced impossible choices. If a child was taken or sold, grief followed. If a child remained, fear persisted. Protection required constant calculation. Should the child be hidden or allowed to play? Should they be encouraged to work hard and appear obedient, or kept unnoticed? Each decision carried potential consequences, and none guaranteed safety. As children grew older, new dangers emerged. Adolescents with light skin faced heightened scrutiny. Their bodies became more visible, their movements more restricted. Mothers had to warn them about punishment, about the danger of being perceived as different. In some cases, children who could potentially pass as white if they escaped had to be taught not to try, because failure would bring severe punishment not only on them but on those connected to them. The emotional toll of raising such children was compounded by the lack of recognition of sexual violence under slavery. There was no language of trauma, no acknowledgement of rape as a crime against enslaved women. Their suffering was normalized, dismissed, or blamed on them. The children born from that violence were treated as property, further erasing the mother's experience. This erasure forced women to carry their trauma privately, without validation or relief. Mothers also had to navigate their children's questions as they grew more aware of difference. Why do I look like this? Why am I treated this way? Why do I not belong anywhere? Answering honestly was dangerous. Evading the questions was painful. Many women chose partial truths, stories shaped to protect rather than explain. The burden of explanation fell entirely on them, even though the violence that created the situation was never theirs. In moments of rare intimacy, some women shared their stories with their children, not in detail but in warning. They taught them to understand power, to recognize danger, to survive. These lessons were not gentle. They were shaped by urgency and fear. Love under these conditions was an act of resistance, even when it had to be expressed quietly. The presence of white-passing children also affected how mothers were treated by the plantation hierarchy. Some owners felt guilt, others irritation, others indifference. None offered justice. Any small protection extended to the child could be withdrawn at any moment. Mothers learned not to trust gestures that looked like favor. Experience taught them that such attention often preceded separation. Despite all this, enslaved women formed deep bonds with their children. These bonds were not weakened by the circumstances of birth, they were intensified. Loving a child in a system designed to break that bond required constant emotional strength. Mothers invested in their children's survival, dignity, and memory, even when the future offered no guarantees. When children were taken, the loss was not only personal but symbolic. It confirmed the system's power to erase evidence of violence by erasing the people who carried it. Mothers were left with absence in memory, forced to continue working, living, and surviving as if nothing had happened. Their grief was not acknowledged, but it shaped the rest of their lives. The experience of raising white passing children under slavery reveals the deeply gendered nature of violence in the system. Enslaved women bore the physical, emotional, and social consequences of abuse while the perpetrators remained protected. The children born into this reality embodied that injustice. Through them, mothers confronted the truth daily, living in a world that demanded silence, endurance, and the acceptance of harm without explanation. White Southern society was built on the belief that racial boundaries were clear, natural, and visible. Whiteness was supposed to be unmistakable, something that could be recognized at a glance and trusted as a marker of freedom, legitimacy, and authority. Slavery depended on this belief. The entire system required people to accept that race was fixed and obvious, that the enslaved could always be identified by their bodies. White passing children shattered that illusion simply by existing. The fear was not only moral but practical. If race could not be reliably seen, then control became unstable. A person who looked white but was legally enslaved disrupted daily assumptions about who could move freely, who needed papers, who could speak without punishment. Slave patrols relied on appearance to police movement. Markets relied on appearance to define value. Social order relied on appearance to enforce hierarchy. White passing children blurred all of it. Plantation owners and lawmakers understood this danger instinctively. That is why so much effort was spent controlling visibility rather than addressing the cause. The system could tolerate violence, coercion, and hypocrisy, but it could not tolerate uncertainty. A blurred racial boundary threatened to expose race as a social invention rather than a biological fact. Once that idea took hold, the moral justification for slavery weakened. White communities responded to this fear by doubling down on legal definitions. If appearance could not be trusted, then law would decide. A person was enslaved because their mother was enslaved, regardless of how they looked. This rule allowed white society to preserve racial hierarchy even when bodies contradicted it. The law became a tool to override the evidence of the senses. At the same time, social enforcement intensified. White passing enslaved people were watched more closely, questioned more aggressively, punished more severely if they stepped out of place. Their bodies were treated as suspicious. Any sign of confidence, literacy, or independence was interpreted as a threat. The closer someone appeared to whiteness, the more dangerous they seemed to the system. There was also a deep anxiety about misidentification. White people feared that enslaved individuals could pass into white society, claim freedom, access jobs, or form relationships that crossed forbidden lines. This fear was exaggerated but persistent. It fueled harsh penalties for escape and reinforced demands for documentation. Papers, passes, and proof of status became essential tools of control, precisely because appearance alone could no longer be trusted. White passing children also threatened the social fabric within white families. Their existence raised uncomfortable questions about lineage, fidelity, and inheritance. A child who resembled a white man but was enslaved suggested that bloodlines were not as pure as claimed. This undermined the mythology of white moral superiority. Rather than confront that reality, white society chose denial and repression. In public discourse, these anxieties were rarely acknowledged openly. Instead, they surfaced indirectly through stricter racial laws, harsher punishments, and increasingly elaborate definitions of who counted as white. Blood quantum rules, ancestry requirements, and racial classifications multiplied. These measures were attempts to shore up a system that felt increasingly fragile. The fear of blurred boundaries also shaped violence. White mobs, patrols, and enforcers acted aggressively toward anyone who seemed out of place. A person who looked white but did not behave according to white norms invited suspicion. Violence became a way to reassert certainty. By punishing ambiguity, white society reassured itself that boundaries still held. White passing enslaved people were often denied any benefit their appearance might suggest. Instead of protection, they faced resentment. Some whites viewed them as evidence of moral contamination, living reminders of taboo crossings. This resentment could be directed at the child, the mother, or both. The system punished those who embodied contradiction. Within white communities, silence again played a role. People noticed these children, but speaking about them risked implicating their own families or neighbors. The same men who condemned racial mixing publicly often participated in it privately. Acknowledging the existence of white passing enslaved children threatened to unravel shared secrets. Silence preserved social cohesion at the cost of truth. The fear extended beyond slavery itself. White society worried about the future. What would happen if large numbers of people who looked white but had been enslaved demanded rights after emancipation? What would happen if racial categories collapsed under scrutiny? These anxieties shaped post-slavery laws and customs, including segregation, which attempted to restore visual certainty by enforcing separation through space rather than ancestry. White-passing children revealed that race was enforced, not discovered. Their existence showed that power, not biology, determined status. This realization was deeply unsettling to a society invested in hierarchy. It suggested that the line between freedom and bondage was arbitrary, maintained through violence rather than nature. Because of this, white society treated these children not as individuals, but as problems. They were managed, moved, hidden, or erased. Their humanity was secondary to the need for order. Each child represented a crack in the foundation, and the response was always to patch the crack rather than examine the structure. The fear of blurred racial boundaries explains why the system reacted so aggressively to what might otherwise have been dismissed as rare exceptions. These children were not rare, they were common enough to threaten stability. Their presence forced white society to confront its own contradictions, and that confrontation was something it worked relentlessly to avoid. In this way, white-passing enslaved children became silent catalysts. They did not need to speak to challenge the system. Their faces did the work. Their existence exposed the artificiality of racial divisions and the violence required to maintain them. The fear they provoked shaped laws, customs, and behavior, reinforcing oppression even as it revealed how fragile its foundations truly were. When plantation owners made decisions about selling or relocating light-skinned children, geography became a tool of control. Distance offered a form of erasure. By sending these children to plantations far from their birthplace, owners could reduce the chance that anyone would recognize them, question their origins, or connect them to the master's household. The further a child traveled, the safer the owner felt from social scrutiny and potential scandal. The child's visibility was inversely proportional to distance, and this logic guided countless transactions across Louisiana and the broader South. Distant sales were carefully orchestrated. Buyers were often chosen from outside the local community to prevent gossip or recognition. Children were described vaguely in bills of sale, their parentage omitted, their skin tone softened or left unmentioned. The records created the appearance of routine commerce, erasing the history that would have exposed sexual exploitation. In this way, distance and documentation worked together to render the child invisible, as though moving them physically could erase the circumstances of their birth. For enslaved mothers, these decisions were devastating. They were powerless to prevent the separation, and often received no explanation. One day, the child who resembled the master might be playing quietly, sitting near the hearth, or helping with chores. The next, they were gone, transported hundreds of miles away, perhaps never to be seen again. Mothers internalized the loss, learning that resemblance to whiteness carried risk rather than protection. Emotional bonds were severed by geography, and grief became another hidden labor, performed silently under the watch of overseers and owners. Distance also served an economic function. Light-skinned children were sometimes considered more marketable in urban areas, where their appearance could fetch higher prices for skilled labor, domestic service, or other perceived advantages. Plantation owners understood that the child's value was tied not only to labor potential but to the discretion and remoteness of their new surroundings. Selling a child far away allowed the owner to capitalize on their physical traits while minimizing the social risk of local recognition. The relocation of these children was rarely gentle. They were often transported in harsh conditions, with minimal oversight, and with little concern for emotional well-being. Journeys could be long and dangerous, exposing children to disease, exhaustion, and trauma. They were removed from family, community, and the only environment they had ever known. Plantation owners treated this as necessary logistics, framing it as routine movement of property rather than an act that disrupted lives and severed bonds. Once relocated, white-passing children faced additional challenges. They entered unfamiliar plantations where overseers and enslaved people alike might treat them with suspicion or resentment. Their light skin could make them targets of jealousy or mistrust, both among other enslaved children and adult laborers. Their resemblance to whites made them distinct, marking them as different, which could increase their vulnerability to exploitation or harsh treatment. Geography insulated the master but not the child. The psychological consequences of separation were profound. Children raised away from their mothers and families often carried trauma for life. They were aware, even at a young age, of the abruptness and finality of their removal. Trust was compromised. Bonds that should have been protective were severed, leaving the child isolated in both physical and social terms. Plantation owners did not consider these effects. For them, the transaction was purely about control, concealment, and profit. Distance also allowed owners to control narrative. By placing children in unfamiliar settings, they reduced the likelihood of rumors spreading back to the local community. Light-skinned infants could not inadvertently expose the master's actions to neighbors or relatives. The farther away the child, the more effective the erasure. Geography became a buffer, insulating the plantation from the evidence of abuse that existed in plain sight within the cabin walls. These relocations revealed a systemic nature of slavery's control over both bodies and stories. It was not enough to physically own the child. Plantation owners needed to manage memory and perception. By moving children far away, they attempted to rewrite history, ensuring that the physical evidence of transgression, the child's appearance, did not generate social, legal, or familial consequences. Geography became a tool of narrative manipulation as much as a tool of labor management. Within enslaved communities, the disappearance of light-skinned children was understood even when the reasons were not spoken aloud. People noticed patterns. Children born to women in certain cabins, children with particular appearances, vanishing from one plantation and never returning. Oral histories retained these memories, preserving a record of loss that the official documentation intentionally obscured. Geography, in this sense, became both a method of erasure and a marker of trauma for those left behind. The strategic use of distance highlights the intersection of race, appearance, and power. Light-skinned children were valuable precisely because they disrupted the visual logic of slavery. Removing them far from home minimized the disruption. It allowed the system to continue functioning without having to confront contradictions openly. Every mile between the child and their birthplace reinforced the illusion that slavery operated within clear, uncontested boundaries, even as reality proved otherwise. Distance also interacted with age. Younger children were easier to move without drawing attention. As they grew and their resemblance to white ancestors became more pronounced, the urgency to relocate them increased. Owners understood that visibility compounded risk. Each additional year raised a potential for recognition, gossip, or questions. Geography became a preemptive measure, employed systematically to protect reputations and prevent the child from exposing truths that were inconvenient to the plantation hierarchy. For the children themselves, distance meant erasure of identity. They lost not only family connections but also cultural and social anchors. Their names could change, their histories rewritten, their existence documented only as property. Physical removal functioned in tandem with bureaucratic removal, ensuring that even if the child survived, they remained isolated from the very communities that could offer recognition or support. This practice also reinforced lessons for other enslaved people. Mothers, siblings, and neighbors learned that children who resembled white men were not protected. They were in fact more likely to be taken far away. The threat of separation became a tool of control, teaching obedience, discouraging questions, and reinforcing the power of the master. Geography, in this way, was not neutral, it was actively weaponized to enforce hierarchy and obedience. Distance, therefore, was both a practical and symbolic strategy. Practically, it concealed evidence of paternity and prevented social complications. Symbolically, it reinforced the boundaries that white society insisted must remain unquestioned. By relocating white passing children to distant plantations, owners could maintain the appearance of racial clarity while exploiting the labor potential of those very children. Each relocation erased part of the child's personal history, ensured obedience, and preserved the plantation's public image. Geography, combined with legal doctrine and surveillance, created a controlled environment where the contradictions of slavery could be managed. Owners could perpetrate sexual violence, father children, and profit from their labor, all while avoiding acknowledgement. Distance allowed these strategies to function effectively, shielding white society from confronting the realities that unfolded in the cabins and ensuring that white passing children remained instruments of secrecy, exploitation, and social control. The existence of white passing children in enslaved communities was among the clearest evidence of slavery's deepest hypocrisy. On one hand, the system proclaimed rigid racial hierarchies. Whiteness signified freedom, purity, and authority. Blackness signified bondage, inferiority, and labor. Yet the children born to enslaved women and white men rendered these distinctions meaningless in the most visible way. Their faces, skin, and hair reflected the very whiteness that slavery claimed should define liberty, highlighting the moral contradictions at the heart of the institution. These children were living proof that sexual violence was not an aberration but a structural component of slavery. Every white passing child represented a moment when laws, customs, and private behavior converged to exploit women while denying accountability to men. Enslaved women had no legal recourse. Their consent was irrelevant. Their children, regardless of appearance, were property. The social and moral order depended on erasing the evidence of abuse. Yet the children themselves could not be erased from daily life. They walked, cried, learned, and grew within the very system that sought to suppress the truth. Owners understood the implications. White passing children forced a private confrontation with the system's own hypocrisy. The children were proof that power could not be exercised cleanly, that morality was routinely violated in ways that were impossible to acknowledge publicly. Plantation managers, overseers, and family members all navigated this contradiction differently. Some attempted concealment, others sale, others subtle favoritism. All relied on silence to prevent exposure. The hypocrisy was sustained not by absence of evidence, but by manipulation of perception. Within the enslaved community, these children embodied a complicated reality. On one level, they were part of the same community, subject to the same restrictions, labor expectations, and dangers. On another level, their appearance set them apart. They could not be mistaken for the general enslaved population. Their faces carried the visible imprint of privilege, coercion, and violation simultaneously. This duality complicated social dynamics, creating tension, fear, and sometimes protection. Community members understood what these children represented and adapted behaviors accordingly, always aware that visibility could bring danger. The hypocrisy extended beyond the plantation itself into the broader social and legal framework. Laws codified the principle that children inherited their mother's status, not their father's, effectively absorbing the consequences of white male exploitation into the system of slavery without challenging the notion of white supremacy. Meanwhile, social norms insisted that sexual relations between white men and enslaved women were taboo in public discussion, even as they occurred frequently and were widely known privately. The combination of law and social expectation allowed power to operate unchecked while maintaining the illusion of order and morality. White passing children also threatened the narrative of whiteness as purity. Their very existence questioned the naturalness of racial categories, showing that blackness and whiteness were not innate traits, but social constructions enforced through violence. Yet the system was unwilling to confront this reality. Instead, it doubled down on appearance, documentation, and geographic separation to manage the contradiction. Children could be removed, sold, or hidden, but their existence could not be entirely erased, creating persistent tension between ideology and reality. The moral hypocrisy was further amplified by the treatment of these children. They were neither fully protected nor fully abandoned. Privileges, when granted, were conditional and could be revoked at any moment. Favoritism was less about care than about control. Children who resembled their white fathers were managed, surveilled, and manipulated to preserve the plantation's order. Emotional bonds between mother and child were constantly threatened by sale or relocation. The children's existence highlighted a system that claimed to uphold values of propriety while routinely violating them. For white plantation families, these children posed another layer of difficulty. Their resemblance to white men could be seen by wives, relatives, and neighbors, creating private embarrassment and social tension. Husbands and fathers often acknowledged these children only in secret, if at all. Wives and daughters might respond with anger or hostility, and public acknowledgement was rare because it would expose sexual abuse and challenge claims of family honor. Silence became both a social strategy and a moral shield. The children's very presence revealed the tension between law, morality, and social perception. Legally, they were property, enslaved like any other child born to an enslaved woman. Morally, their existence demonstrated the pervasive abuse of power inherent to slavery. Socially, they threatened the appearance of a rigid racial hierarchy. Each dimension reinforced and contradicted the others, creating a persistent tension that plantation society was forced to manage continuously through concealment, manipulation, and relocation. Even among enslaved people, the children's presence highlighted injustice in stark terms. Mothers bore the consequences of rape and coercion, yet their labor and emotional energy were the only aspects of the system that could be relied upon. Children grew up under conditions that constantly reminded them of the violence that produced them, yet their survival often depended on silence and adaptation. Their lives were a testament to resilience, but also a reminder that slavery's ideology was enforced at the expense of human truth. White passing children also played a role in long-term social memory. Families of enslaved people retained knowledge of these children through oral histories, even when official records erased their existence. Their stories carried lessons about power, violence, resilience, and secrecy. They preserved evidence of hypocrisy that written records and legal codes attempted to suppress. In this sense, the children were both products of oppression and vessels of historical truth, challenging the narratives that plantation owners sought to control. The contradictions embodied by these children illustrate how deeply intertwined race, power, and exploitation were under slavery. Their lives were managed carefully to protect the illusion of moral and social order while simultaneously revealing the system's brutality. Every aspect of their existence, from concealment at birth to legal classification, from geographic relocation to social surveillance, was designed to suppress truth while preserving control. The hypocrisy was unavoidable. The system depended on visibility and invisibility at the same time, on enforcing rules that it routinely violated, and on protecting those who caused harm while punishing those who were harmed. In the end, white passing children were more than anomalies. They were evidence, living contradictions that exposed the gaps between law, morality, and social ideology. Their presence forced plantation owners, overseers, and white society to constantly navigate the tension between what was visible and what could be acknowledged. For the enslaved community, they were daily reminders of violence, resilience, and survival. Each child's life bore witness to the cruelty of slavery, revealing its hypocrisy in ways that words alone could never fully capture, and ensuring that the truth of sexual exploitation and racial manipulation could not be entirely hidden from history. The story of white passing children in Louisiana slave cabins is more than a historical curiosity. It is a mirror reflecting the contradictions, cruelty, and calculated silence that underpin the system of slavery. These children were living evidence of sexual violence, legal manipulation, and social hypocrisy. They embodied the collision of biology and law, intimacy and exploitation, visibility and erasure. Plantation owners tried to manage them as property, relocate them to maintain appearances, and manipulate records to suppress the truth, but their very existence defied control. Their lives reveal the lengths to which a system will go to protect itself: the concealment at birth, the careful sales to distant plantations, the constant surveillance, the legal doctrines that stripped fathers of responsibility while reinforcing ownership. Each action was designed to hide the human cost of power and maintain the illusion of moral and racial order. Yet no law, no geography, and no ledger could erase the reality written on the children's faces or the grief carried by their mothers. These stories force us to confront the full scale of slavery's exploitation, not only of labor, but of bodies, families, and humanity. They remind us that systems of oppression are sustained not just by overt violence, but by silence, by the careful policing of memory, and by the manipulation of truth. The white passing children were both victims and living witnesses, carrying the legacy of injustice that slavery attempted to deny. Ultimately, their lives underscore a profound lesson. History cannot be fully hidden. Even when records are erased, even when silence is enforced, the traces of cruelty, resilience, and survival persist. The stories of these children, their mothers, and the communities that endured and remembered them challenge us to see the human cost behind the abstractions of law and property. They demand acknowledgement, reflection, and reckoning. In remembering them, we reclaim the truths that slavery sought to erase. We recognize the courage of those who survived, the strength of mothers who loved under impossible conditions, and the enduring consequences of a system built on exploitation. These children, once hidden, once erased, now stand as powerful witnesses to history, ensuring that the voices, faces, and experiences that slavery tried to bury will never be forgotten. Their existence is a testament to survival against deliberate erasure, a reminder that the consequences of injustice echo across generations, and a call to confront the moral truths that history sometimes seeks to conceal. In honoring their story, we do more than recount history. We illuminate the resilience of humanity in the face of profound oppression and ensure that the lessons of the past remain vivid, unflinching, and undeniable.